What would your younger self say about how your family turned out?
Do you know your true worth? I thought I did, until I realized that every single accomplishment I had in my life had been quietly overshadowed, minimized, or twisted into something that only served my parents' favorite people, my two brothers. From the outside, it looked like we were a tight-knit family that supported one another, but if you scratched even a little beneath the surface, you would see what I eventually had to face head-on. My role was never daughter, it was unpaid labor, on-call problem solver, and backup plan. They crowned my brothers as the stars of the family, the royalty who could do no wrong, while I was the one silently keeping the castle from collapsing. It started small, the kind of innocent stuff you brush off when you are younger, like being told to give up my weekends to help at the family shop while my brothers were too busy with school or needed to rest. I was expected to make myself useful while they were encouraged to dream big. At first, I convinced myself that it was fine, that it was temporary, that once everyone grew older, things would even out. But they didn't. Instead, every year the gap widened until it became a gaping hole where my sense of worth should have been. By the time I was in my 30s, working full-time at my own job, I was still being treated like the safety net of the household. My father would call me during office hours to remind me to file paperwork for the shop. My mother would send me lists of invoices to check over because you're good with details. My brothers would casually text me for contacts, asking if I could forward them vendor information or fix errors they made on orders, and they did it without even saying thank you. They assumed I was available because that was the role they had cast me in since childhood. The breaking point came one weekend when my mother gathered us all together and proudly announced that the shop was about to launch a new Bennett Boys expansion. She actually used that phrase, like it was a brand. She explained how Ethan, the older one, was going to lead it with his so-called business expertise, while Mark, the younger one, would be in charge of creative direction. Then she turned to me, not with congratulations or acknowledgement, but with a list of tasks she expected me to handle: filings, renewals, spreadsheets, compliance reminders, and vendor negotiations. And she said it in the same tone you'd use to remind someone to take out the trash. That night, I went home and actually made a list of every single thing I managed for them, not just occasionally, but on a rolling basis. It shocked me how much of their infrastructure rested quietly on my shoulders. I was paying for the family phone plan. I was listed as the contact for the business software. I handled their cloud storage renewal. I kept track of the printer lease. I was the one who always remembered the filing deadlines for the state business license. It wasn't a handful of favors, it was a second job, unpaid, and completely unrecognized. I sat staring at the list for hours, and it hit me that if I died tomorrow, none of them would even know how to log into half these accounts, let alone keep the business compliant. They didn't respect me, but they relied on me more than they even realized. That thought made me angry, but it also gave me clarity. If they wanted my time, my labor, my knowledge, they could finally pay for it, or they could learn to live without it. The next morning, I drafted a set of itemized invoices for every hour of work I had put in over the past quarter. I attached transfer requests for all the subscriptions I managed, noting that they needed to be moved to accounts in their names immediately. I wasn't rude or dramatic. I was precise, professional, and impossible to ignore. When I hit send, my hands were shaking, not because I doubted myself, but because for the first time in years I wasn't begging for recognition, I was demanding accountability. Of course, my mother's reply came almost instantly: "We do not pay family." My father chimed in half an hour later: "We can't move the accounts, we don't know the passwords." That was the moment I realized just how dependent they really were on me. They had built this whole facade of the Bennett boys being capable and brilliant, but the truth was they couldn't even function without the invisible daughter who handled the boring details. I sat there staring at those replies, and for once, I didn't feel guilt. I felt relief. I finally understood my true worth. And I decided that if they weren't willing to recognize it, I would force them to live without it. Because sometimes the loudest statement you can ever make is to stop showing up. And that's exactly what I did next. After I sent those invoices and transfer requests, I honestly expected a fight, or maybe even some loud denial or shouting match like the ones I used to get caught in during holidays when someone said the quiet part out loud, but instead, what I got was even more telling: silence, followed by a flurry of awkward deflections, like they hoped I would forget what I said if they just acted like it hadn't happened. It was almost funny in a twisted way, the way my mother responded with, "Let's talk about this after the family dinner," as if everything could be reset by passing around mashed potatoes and fake smiles. And my father simply forwarded the subscription notices I had asked them to take over, with no comment, as though I might just cave and do it anyway out of habit. But I didn't cave. I watched those auto-renewal emails pile up in their inboxes, and I watched the business software send its own string of warnings, each more urgent than the last, until I knew something would have to give. And it gave, all right, at the most predictable moment of the year. Our family's annual community center dinner, the one my mom insisted on hosting every spring, where distant relatives and old neighbors gathered to celebrate legacy, which was just code for throwing another party that centered my brothers and positioned me somewhere near the buffet table, where I could help refill things while smiling like I didn't notice how often I was being erased from the photo lineups or miscredited for work I did behind the scenes. I told myself I would go one last time, but I wasn't going to lift a finger for it. No shopping, no printing, no late-night graphic work for Ethan's slideshow. I came as a guest and nothing more. And I could tell from the moment I walked in that they didn't know what to do with me like that. My mother was flustered, whispering sharply about the missing name tags and how the slideshow wasn't starting, and I just stood there sipping my water, listening to her scramble to find someone who could fix the HDMI connection. Normally, that would have been me, crawling behind a table with a flashlight, but this time I didn't even blink. When my older brother stood up to give his speech about the new chapter in the family business, he went on and on about innovation and collaboration, and then thanked everyone who made this possible, including Mark for the creative vision, and my parents for believing in the dream. My name didn't come up once. Not in passing. Not in gratitude. Nothing. Just erased again. And I watched it happen with a kind of detached clarity, like I was finally seeing the script from outside the performance. Later, as people mingled, Diane pulled me aside with her usual tight-lipped smile and told me how proud she was of the boys and how happy it made her that everyone sees their greatness now. Then, just as casually, she handed me a folder and said, "Here's the RSVP list and receipts. I know you're good at organizing, so you'll probably want to archive it for us like usual." That moment was the one. I didn't explode, I didn't cry, I didn't even blink. I simply said, "I'm not doing that anymore," handed the folder back to her, and walked away without waiting for her reaction. But I didn't stop there. The next day, I sent one simple email to every vendor, client, and family contact who had ever reached out to me about shop matters. The message was short and formal. As of this month, I am no longer involved in the management or operations of the Bennett business. For all inquiries, please contact Ethan or Mark directly at the following emails. And I copied both of them. Then I logged out of the inbox I had monitored for years, cleared my saved passwords, and deleted the auto-reminders from my phone. Within 24 hours, the consequences started landing. The first was a misprinted order that went out to one of our longtime clients because Mark had clicked approve without reviewing the file. The second was a delivery that got sent to the wrong address because Ethan didn't realize I had always double-checked vendor confirmations. And the third was a message from a local church group that had worked with us for over a decade, asking, "Is Laura okay?" She always handled things so well. By the end of that week, my mother called me at 7 in the morning in full panic mode, her voice that fake calm tone she used when she didn't want to admit she was scared. She said, "Honey, the deliveries are all wrong, and we need your help fixing this. I'm sure you can talk to someone and get it sorted out. Just this once." But it wasn't just this once. It had never been just this once. It had been a lifetime of just this once, strung together by guilt and obligation and the kind of love that only ever flowed one way. So I said the words I had never allowed myself to say before: "Ask your point of contact." Then I hung up. and I didn't answer when they called back. It's strange how many things you can sign up for without realizing the weight of what you're really agreeing to, how many times someone can say, "It's just paperwork," or "You're just the point of contact." Until one day you're sitting across from a landlord with a file in his hands that has your name on every critical page, and he's looking at you like you owe him more than an explanation. That was the moment I realized I hadn't just been carrying emotional baggage or doing unpaid work out of habit. I was legally and financially entangled in a system that had never once respected my boundaries, but had absolutely no issue tying my name to every risk they didn't want to hold themselves accountable for. After I cut off my involvement and redirected the communication channels, I expected the chaos that followed, the missed orders, the client complaints, the delivery errors. All of that made perfect sense because I had always been the one smoothing out those wrinkles before anyone even noticed they were there. But what I didn't anticipate, not really, was just how far they had gone in assuming that my presence, my name, and my responsibility were default settings they could rely on without consent. It wasn't just moral laziness, it was practical negligence, and my signature was the one quietly keeping their illusion afloat. It started when I pulled my credit report, not because I thought anything was wrong, but because something in me needed confirmation that I hadn't completely lost control. What I found hit me like a punch in the chest. There was a note tied to the business address, a lease record, something about a commercial space agreement that referenced me as the responsible party for correspondence and renewal. It wasn't an official cosigner status, but it was enough of a legal gray area that if something went wrong, I would be the first one to get the call. I drove to see Mr. Patel, the landlord of the shop's building, not out of panic, but out of the sudden, overwhelming need to take back what I had given away so casually for so long. He didn't seem surprised to see me, which told me a lot already, and when I asked him to clarify exactly what my role was in the lease structure, he calmly opened his drawer, pulled out the agreement, and pointed at the section where my name was listed under Primary Business Contact for Legal and Operational Updates. I hadn't signed the lease, but I had been the one sending in the renewal forms for years, the one who always called to ask for extensions or negotiate late fee waivers, the one who set up the automatic payments that went out from the business account I used to manage when my brothers couldn't be bothered to remember passwords. I told him plainly that I no longer represented the business in any capacity and that I was submitting a formal request to have my name removed from all correspondence roles. I handed him a written statement, signed and dated, with a copy for my records. He nodded, said he understood, and made a dry comment I'll never forget. The ones who run things usually don't make the noise. When I got home, I didn't stop there. I froze my credit, not because there had been fraud, but because I no longer trusted my family not to accidentally entangle me further. I deleted the saved payment methods from the business vendor portals. I removed the auto-pay settings I had created under my own email logins. I checked every single platform where I had once been the admin, and I shut every backdoor they had ever walked through without asking. Then came the insurance bomb. I had quietly added my parents to my employer-sponsored plan years ago, back when my dad had a minor surgery and my mom was going through a rough patch. It was easier at the time to just say yes than to argue with the guilt and the "you're the only one who can help us right now" lines that always made me feel like saying no would make me a bad daughter. But now I was done being a daughter in name only. I logged into my HR portal and removed them both. It was entirely legal, within policy guidelines, and required no explanation. I followed it with a short email to HR to confirm the removal and another to my parents, just as concise. Effective next month, you'll need to secure your own coverage. They didn't respond immediately, but Ethan did, of course he did. He sent a long, rambling message about how the shop needs continuity and how you can't just walk away from your responsibilities, as though he had any right to lecture me on obligations when he hadn't even known where the tax forms were stored until I uploaded them every year. He told me I was overreacting, that I was going to destroy the business by pulling away at such a critical moment, and that I should at least stay on until the expansion was finalized. That was the moment it became crystal clear. He didn't care that I had never been compensated, never credited, never thanked. He just cared that the machine I had quietly built to keep everything running was now shutting down. And he had no idea how to fix it. So I made my next move with surgical precision. I formally resigned as the registered agent for the business, a process that required just a few clicks and a small filing fee, and I made sure the notification would be sent directly to the shop's physical address, not to any email I controlled. I revoked all admin access from my personal accounts and sent the final transition notice along with the domain I had purchased for their website years ago, transferred to their name, with a clear note, renewal due in 30 days. When Diane called the next night, her voice sounded different. Not angry, not guilt-tripping, just rattled. She said, "You're leaving us exposed." And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to soften the blow or explain myself or pretend it was mutual. I simply replied, "No. I'm leaving you responsible." And with that, I turned off my phone for the weekend and let the silence do the talking. By the time the notifications had all been rerouted, the passwords changed, and the official filings submitted with names that were no longer mine, I expected some kind of lull. Maybe even a false sense of calm before the next wave of dysfunction crashed back into my life, because I knew my family well enough to understand that they didn't go down with a bang, they collapsed slowly, through denials and finger-pointing and increasingly desperate attempts to patch the holes without admitting where the leaks came from. What I didn't expect, however, was how quickly the outside world, people who had never taken sides, but always knew where the actual competence lived, began to notice something had shifted, not because I made an announcement or tried to expose anyone, but simply because I stopped picking up the slack. It began with a phone call I didn't answer, from one of our oldest clients, a woman named Donna who ran operations at Carter Supply, the kind of client who didn't care about titles or family trees or who smiled the widest at networking events. She just cared about results. I saw her number pop up and, out of habit, my hand twitched toward the phone, but I let it ring because I knew if I picked up even once, I'd be back in it, solving problems I didn't cause for people who still hadn't thanked me for the last 10 things I fixed. A minute later, I received a polite but direct email that simply read, "Hi Laura, just checking, are you still overseeing the file prep? I've had some misalignments on the last 2 runs. If not, who's best to contact?" And there it was. I didn't respond right away. I thought about it for a day, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to be clear. The next morning, I sent her a short but respectful reply, explaining that I was no longer involved with the shop's operations, that all file review and production oversight was now in the hands of Ethan and Mark, and that I'd copied them in for continuity. I thanked her for the years of collaboration and added, "If you ever need independent consulting on systems or process management, I've shifted into that space and would be happy to talk." It wasn't a pitch, it was a door left open, quietly and professionally. 2 days later, I got a reply from her, not just polite but unusually candid. She said she appreciated the clarity, mentioned that things had indeed started slipping, and noted that it was clear who used to care about the details. That sentence stuck with me more than I expected. It didn't make me feel smug, but it did validate something I had been gaslight out of believing for years, that my contribution wasn't invisible, it was just inconvenient for people who preferred to pretend they could function without it. Around the same time, I received another email, this one from the Pine Harbor HOA, a longtime recurring client that always ordered monthly mailers and community updates through the shop. The subject line read, "Urgent reprint needed," and the body of the message detailed a botched layout, missing addresses, and incorrect paper stock that had already gone to the printer. I didn't even need to ask what had happened. I knew that whoever had approved the final proof hadn't read it, hadn't verified the details, and hadn't cared enough to catch the errors that were second nature to me. I replied with a version of the same message I sent to Donna, clean and professional, making no excuses, taking no blame, just handing the accountability where it belonged. And then came the moment that made everything snap into place. I opened LinkedIn, not to make an announcement or go public in any dramatic way, but simply to update my profile. I changed my headline from Operations Support, Bennett Print, to Process Consultant Workflow Systems, Small Business Efficiency. Then I wrote a short post. After years of helping businesses run behind the scenes, I've stepped into consulting for teams that want their systems to actually work. If you need help with file control, vendor timelines, or deadline management, reach out. I'm here. I didn't name names. I didn't spill family secrets. I just showed up as who I actually was, without hiding behind their brand anymore. Within 48 hours, I had 3 DMs from people who knew me through the shop, from former vendors, from an event organizer who remembered how the print stuff always ran smoothly when you were involved. None of them were interested in the shop itself. They were interested in working with me, directly, cleanly, without all the mess of pretending I was just someone's sister doing a few favors. Meanwhile, the fallout continued behind the scenes. My mother called to ask how to re-enable vendor access after Ethan apparently deleted a login by accident. I told her that wasn't something I could assist with anymore. My father texted to ask where the customer service files were stored. I reminded him that he had access to the new account that Ethan set up and that I no longer had the password. And then, right on schedule, I got a voicemail from Diane, her voice thinner than usual, saying that Mr. Patel, the landlord, had reached out because the lease renewal form hadn't been returned and late fees were about to apply. She ended the message with, "He said we need whoever used to handle this to come in and fix it." I didn't call back. Instead, I sent one sentence in response: "That person resigned." It wasn't bitter, it wasn't cruel, and it wasn't meant to gloat. It was just the truth, one that had taken me years to say out loud. And while they scrambled to figure out how to do the very basics of what I had done without thinking for over a decade, I opened my calendar and booked my first paid consultation slot with a new client, someone who saw my value not as a sibling or a fallback, but as the person who actually got things done. And that felt better than any apology ever could. It's remarkable how people who never saw your value until it benefited them will suddenly find it unbearable when that value is no longer available on demand. And while I had always assumed that my walking away would create some ripple effects, I hadn't expected the magnitude of the collapse to unfold so clearly, so quickly, and so irreversibly, not because I made a scene or tried to burn bridges, but because I removed the one quiet piece that had kept the whole thing from toppling over me. And once I was no longer accessible, no longer absorbing the chaos, no longer fixing, smoothing, and absorbing blame while others took credit, the dysfunction could no longer hide behind my competence. It had to stand on its own, and it couldn't. The moment of final clarity came when Diane left a voicemail with a tone I hadn't heard since I was a teenager, tight, nervous, and barely held together, saying that Mr. Patel had officially scheduled a meeting regarding the lease situation because the shop had failed to submit the updated compliance documents, missed the last 2 communications from the business licensing department, and now there were real consequences on the table. She said it in a whisper, like the walls were listening, and she added, "He says someone has to be there in person, someone who understands what's going on." The translation was obvious. They wanted me to return, not out of love or regret, but out of desperation. And this is where the old version of me, the version trained to protect the family's reputation no matter how much it cost me emotionally or professionally, would have walked into that meeting with a calm smile, cleaned up the mess, smoothed over the tension, and left with a pit in my stomach and a compliment I didn't ask for. But I didn't do that this time. This time, I said I would show up, but on my terms. I told Diane I would attend the meeting only if Ethan and Mark were both present, and if they acknowledged in writing that they were responsible for the decisions going forward. I wasn't coming back. I was drawing the line that should have existed a decade ago. The meeting happened in a cramped back office that smelled like paper and old carpet, with Mr. Patel flipping through documents while my brothers sat on either side of the table, noticeably uncomfortable in a space that required answers instead of applause. Mr. Patel didn't waste time. He pointed at the renewal deadlines, the compliance forms, the updated vendor insurance slips that hadn't been filed, and then, without raising his voice, asked a simple question: who is responsible for this business now? There was a pause that felt longer than it was, and I watched Ethan look at Mark, who stared back like they were hoping one of them would come up with a sentence that made sense. I didn't speak. I waited. Eventually, Ethan mumbled something about adjustments and transitions, and Mr. Patel cut him off with a single look before turning to me. Laura, you used to be the one who handled this. Are you no longer involved? I answered him with the calmest voice I've ever used. No, sir. I resigned my role, transferred access, and provided all necessary documentation to the new owners. This is their responsibility now. And I meant it. Every word. After that meeting, my family tried one last time to drag me back into the fold, this time under the guise of a one-time favor. Diane called later that evening and asked if I could just draft a quick overview, something to help them stay on track until they could figure out the new system. I told her I would do it once, as a professional courtesy, but not for free. I sent over a formal estimate for a single document, a streamlined, detailed transition report outlining systems, logins, vendor schedules, tax reminders, and operational workflows. I made sure the tone was clinical, precise, and completely devoid of emotional softening. The invoice was attached. She didn't respond for 2 days. Then came a single message from Ethan. Send it over. We'll pay. I sent the file. I archived the email. I marked the invoice as paid. I deleted the shared folders. What followed wasn't dramatic. There were no yelling matches or public confrontations. It was quieter than that, and somehow even more final. I stopped receiving calls, not because they finally understood me, but because they realized the old version of me, the endlessly available fixer, the silent workhorse they could summon with a guilt trip, was gone. And in her place was someone who valued her time, her name, her credit, her boundaries. Weeks passed, and then, as if on cue, an envelope arrived in the mail with a familiar handwriting I hadn't seen in a while. It was an invitation to the upcoming holiday dinner, the one I used to organize every year down to the last chair. The note inside read, "This year's gathering will be for immediate family only. Thank you for understanding." No name, no signature. Just that one sentence, printed on glossy paper as if it carried authority. I read it twice, then laughed, not out of cruelty, but out of complete and total freedom. I booked a solo weekend trip to the coast, reserved a nice room with a view, scheduled a massage, and left my phone on silent the entire time. I didn't respond to the invitation. I didn't ask why. I didn't care. Because when you finally walk away from people who only valued your usefulness, not your personhood, you don't need to make noise or prove a point. You just need to keep walking. And their silence, their panic, their unraveling in your absence, that becomes the loudest thing you ever said.